It occurred to me way too late that getting this video out sometime before the end of 2023 would have been neat on account of Disney's 100th anniversary. But not only did said anniversary end up being mostly lukewarm for the company at best, it's Thanksgiving as I'm writing this and you are going to be seeing this video in March at the earliest. What is this video anyway? Well, person who clicked without reading the title, we're going to take a way too long, way too comprehensive, way too copyright unsafe look at which Disney properties are best translated by their appearances in Kingdom Hearts. This is entirely distinct from which worlds play best or which ones have the most interesting stories. This is entirely about my judgment of how visuals, themes, dialogue, characters, and plot points make it unchanged, straight from the movies to the games. The more of those that a world's translation of a movie has, the higher up it goes on the tier list, and it'll lose standing depending on how many major plot points, locations, or characters are cut. Now, some caveats. If you're not interested in me laying out the rules, as it were, skip ahead to the next chapter in the video. First, and likely most controversial, for the purposes of this list, I've elected to ignore Chain of Memories, Recoded 358 over 2 days, 0.2, and the mobile games. Assuming I don't totally bungle it, this video is a part of March Caprice, a KH fan initiative which I'll link in the description, and it works out that focusing exclusively on what I consider the quote-unquote main games will help keep this video under the hour-length limit for submissions, and also make it more likely that I actually finish on time. Beyond that though, my reasons for ignoring these quote-unquote side games are manifold. 0.2 obviously has no Disney presence beyond Mickey, Donald, Goofy, and Yensid, and a bunch of mangled locales. Com and Coded both feature simulated retreads of material from KH1 and barely do anything with the Disney stories as it is, and you will not find an instinct stronger in my heart than ignoring the KH mobile games. 358 over 2 days was something I fought with myself on, but I ultimately decided that it's better off ignored, since it's the game with the least amount of direct Disney interactions besides 0.2, and almost none of the Disney material that is present is pulling anything from the films. It very briefly occurred to me to check if 358 or any game bothered to pull material from any of the numerous TV shows, but that would officially be too much of a time sink, and if it were true, I'd have heard about it by now. Obviously, I won't be talking about movies that only get represented by a token character appearance rather than a whole world. So no Ratatouille, no Chicken Little, no Lady and the Tramp, no 101 Dalmatians, no Sword in the Stone, no Bambi, no Dumbo, no DuckTales, no Wreck-It Ralph. In the interest of fairness, I'm not going to dock points from a world for not having characters or plot points if the timeline of the game doesn't cover that material. For instance, I'm not going to take anything away from, say, Land of Dragons for not incorporating Mulan's parents or grandma, because they're just not present in the stretch of story that KH2 adapts. There's also going to be some things which you just have to take for granted in basically all of these games, such as how, unless it's KH3, any scene from the movies which calls for a crowd of people is straight up not getting adapted for hardware reasons. So if a scene like that is ever omitted and I don't bring it up, assume that that's the reason. Finally, if a movie is represented multiple times in the series, then each appearance will be counted in some fashion, whether that's material from one movie being spread across multiple games or different games adapting different movies from the same franchise. By that same token, worlds appearing in Dream Drop Distance or Birth by Sleep, which are visited by different playable characters, will obviously have every character's visit taken into account. Despite all the laying out of rules I just did, I want it to be clear that there's no hard grading system here. This is meant to be more of a loose, fun experiment than anything else, and I say that less for you than I do for myself, so that I don't get stuck in a forever loop of rewriting this video every single time that I marginally twist or even break one of my own self-imposed caveats. Going largely off vibes, I'm just gonna list off what is and isn't kept from the films and make a tier placement. This is the kind of subject matter that's flexible and open to interpretation, so if you'd tier these differently, let me know in the comments. And please comment if there's anything I missed, as I'm sure there is. And I gotta say that in the process of writing this, I've come to really appreciate just how non-uniform the franchise's approach to adaptation actually is. Hopefully this video creates some of that same appreciation in you, and if not, you get to listen to me ramble about a subject I'm interested in. So, there's that. I'm actually going to start with something I call Special Tier, which is where I'll put the two worlds in the franchise which aren't adapting traditional narrative movies, those being Symphony of Sorcery and Dream Drop Distance and Timeless River in KH2. While Fantasia is packaged as a movie, what both these worlds are ultimately adapting is a collection of shorts, and Fantasia's shorts mostly don't bother with a straightforward plot that KH can really adapt. The game gives us the most iconic parts of the famous Sorcerer's Apprentice sequence, with Mickey taking Yensid's hat and enchanting the brooms while he dozes off, but beyond that quote-unquote plot point, the most this world can do for the movie is adapt locations, imagery, and music, which in fairness it does a good amount of. We get Mickey casting spells atop the mountain, locations make it in like the forest from the Nutcracker Suite, Mount Olympus as portrayed in the Pastoral Symphony, and of course Bald Mountain. Much of the movie doesn't make it in. The most abstract parts of Fantasia, the parts which Deems Taylor describes as music existing purely for its own sake, are largely ignored. But there's also no dinosaurs or anything else from The Rite of Spring for that matter, nothing from the Dance of the Hours, and even though we have rep for locations, Chernabog, Yensid, and Mickey are the only living things that make it in from the film. We have the Brooms and Chernabog's little flunkies, I guess, but are they alive? I don't know. I mean, the lack of other characters tracks, seeing as everyone in the Pastoral Symphony is naked or at least topless if they're not blind drunk, and they probably didn't want to expose Sora's innocent eyes to such indecency. He is still a minor after all. Another little cut, or I guess chop, worth noting for me is how we don't get to see Mickey take an axe to the broom, leading to the creation of tons more brooms. He just starts out with a whole bunch. Something else that justifies this being in a special tier is the fact that certain imagery from the movie is adapted, just not within the confines of this world or even this game. Mickey floating in a giant ocean by standing atop a huge book is an image that makes it into Birth by Sleep, and Yensid doing his big parting of the seas gesture makes it into KH3. Before moving on, I wanted to briefly sidetrack and note that while watching Fantasia for this video, it really struck me that in 1940 a majority of film audiences probably did indeed need the concepts of dinosaurs and evolution slowly explained to them in the middle of the film. Like, could you imagine ever not knowing what a dinosaur is? Can you believe that Mickey Mouse predates the public understanding of dinosaurs? That's crazy to me. Timeless River pulls from a multitude of classic Mickey Mouse shorts, including most obviously Steamboat Willie, but also Building a Building, The Firefighters, Gulliver Mickey, and Mickey's Orphans. Notably absent character-wise are the Lilliputians, what I can only describe as the Pete Spider, Mickey's plethora of nephews, his co-workers at the fire station and construction site, any inhabitants of the burning building, the orphaned kittens, and most importantly to me, any past version of Minnie, who appears in most of these shorts. That last omission, unlike many that we'll see later, has less to do with truncating the stories being pulled from, and more to do with not contradicting the Kingdom Hearts lore. In these games, Minnie is portrayed as the side of the couple who was born into royalty, so it wouldn't totally make sense to have her here, taking part in Mickey's lower middle class shenanigans, like being nearly immolated. Not sure why Pluto isn't here though, I guess he's like the KH equivalent to Queen Elizabeth's corgis. Timeless River also features much less animal abuse on Mickey's part than Steamboat Willie does, and a much more innocent and reasonable version of Pete than is collectively portrayed in these shorts. Moving on, bottom tier is what I'll call the sequel/original story tier, or the SOS tier for short. This is where all the worlds go that aren't really trying to directly adapt a movie at all, except for one or two plot points or images, and instead tell a story that exists adjacent to or follows up the one from the film. With that in mind, I'm going to start by collectively knocking out San Francisco, Monstropolis, and Toy Box together. All worlds from KH3 that are explicitly original stories that follow on from the events of the films, and as a result don't have the space to recreate any plot points, scenarios, imagery, or dialogue. The conflicts of each movie have already been resolved by the time our heroes show up, which means villains like Callahan or Waternoose don't appear. Honestly, half the cast of Toy Story is gone, and with an in-story reason as for why they're not around to boot. Besides that, supporting characters like Celia and Aunt Cass never get a mention. Honestly, rather than rattle off all that's gone, it's best to just say that these worlds get to the bottom spot by virtue of not really trying, then move on. You know what's a similar but slightly different case to these? Olympus. The implication as soon as you set foot in the place in KH1 is that the events of Hercules the movie have already happened, and were it not for the fact that KH2 repositions Herc and Megara as just friends who are clearly into each other rather than overt romantic partners, there's not really anything in the games to contradict that idea. When he meets Sora, Donald, and Goofy, Hercules has already met and established his ongoing rivalry with Hades, already unlocked his full potential as a demigod, and is already renowned far and wide as a hero. In spite of this, however, there are specific moments where the games adapt the movie's imagery, like Hercules diving into the Pit of Lost Souls to rescue Meg, or the way that he gets rid of the Titans in KH3. It's not enough to move this world up a tier, but it is one over on the previous batch. Helping is that between the three games, we get to explore most of the movie's locations. With Herc, Meg, Phil, Pegasus, Hades, Zeus, Pain, and Panic all being present at some point, there's basically no major characters with noteworthy dialogue left out from the movie, with the notable exception of the Muses. For being in this tier, there's actually a lot of the movie that's represented here. Although, last note on Olympus, like I mentioned in the KH1 World Rankings, Hercules is the movie that's worst represented by the Kingdom Hearts series in terms of general vibe. Literally every other world in this video does a better job than this one does at capturing the feeling and tone of its film. And that's largely because, with one big exception we'll talk about later, Hercules is far and away the most harebrained, zaniest movie to ever touch these games. It's close to being pure comedy by genre, filled with slapstick and a punchline for nearly every line of dialogue, and the games just don't communicate that aspect of it at all. Space Paranoids is in this tier, but it's a really weird case. Like many worlds that will come in the later tiers, it's one that broadly adapts Acts 2 and 3 of a movie, but the game does this while all but outright confirming that the events of the film have taken place off screen before the game even starts, with our heroes all entering a copy of the NCOM program while the original was destroyed. This means what we're playing through is basically a sequel to Tron, with an in-universe explanation for why Tron, Sark, and the MCP are the only characters to make it in from the movie, being programs who were ported into this copy of the film's world. That said, some visuals, plot points, and even dialogue do get taken from the film, such as Tron telling Sark, "I'm also better than you," the good guys having to steal a solar sailor, Sark and the MCP discussing how to deal with Tron, and Sark turning giant. The big crack in the wall through which our heroes escape the light cycle game is visually close to identical in both versions, and we keep the plates which the MCU uses to protect himself for the boss fight against him. There's also naturally the iconic image of Tron receiving a special disc that's key to defeating the enemy. Locations that make it in from the game are the game grid, the IO tower, the solar sailor, and the MCP base. Something I find very interesting is how Tron is characterized across his appearances. He just comes off as a much warmer, sweeter, mellow guy in Kingdom Hearts, where his movie counterpart is comparatively no-nonsense and tightly wound. Even Bruce Boxleitner's performance feels like it's playing up the charm and optimism much more in KH2. It's the most that any Disney character feels like a different guy from film to game in terms of just vibes. It's also a little funny, and kind of a missed opportunity, I think, that Tron just immediately identifies Sora, Donald, and Goofy as users, rather than doing what the film does and having every other program assume that Flynn is merely one of them, only to be shocked once it's revealed that he's one of their exalted figures. Another one that I've decided goes here in the original story / kinda sorta prequel sense is Birth by Sleep's Deep Space. Now, that's not 100% true. Deep Space basically adapts one specific scene from Lilo and Stitch, that being Stitch's escape from prison, all of which happens before the movie even drops its title card. But the game expands that sequence so greatly that it really can't be taken the same way that it is in the movie's context. The world features all but one of the major characters who appear in that sequence, namely Stitch, Jumba, Gantu, and the Grand Councilwoman. But we also add a character who wasn't present in the film at all in the form of Stitch's electrical cousin Sparky. As far as plot points being directly adapted, we have Stitch's breaking out of prison and stealing a squad car which he engages the hyperspace jump with, the general idea of Gantu hunting Stitch throughout the ship, and someone of relative authority speaking with Jumba in his prison cell, only now it's Terra instead of an absent Pleakley. That said, Gantu actually engaging Stitch in combat never happens at this point in the film, nor does Stitch develop his understanding of empathy and friendship quite so early. In terms of locations, because so little of the film is spent on this ship, almost every room is also a wholly original creation. Next up, From Deep Space to Deep Jungle. Points for adapting the visuals of the treehouse and the camp pretty perfectly, down to the Mrs. Potts tea set, but aside from Clayton going from a nominal good guy to a gorilla hunting villain, the world can't really be said to adapt anything of note from its movie. Tarzan, Jane, Clayton, Sabor, Turk, Kala, and Kerchak make it in from the film, but those last three don't talk, and none of their character really ends up being conveyed, so I'm tempted to say that they don't count. Kerchak doesn't even die. Clayton does die, I assume, but I'm gonna count the lack of meaningful confrontation between he and Tarzan, and an assertion of what being a man really means as a noteworthy omission. On top of that, the Professor and Tantor are outright removed. Also gone from the movie is any implication that there's a narrative ticking clock on Jane's need to study the gorillas, or any sense of her and Tarzan as love interests. Tarzan's own central character arc of being torn between two worlds is also gone, and I'm gonna count the boat back to England as a noteworthy location, which doesn't make it from the film. Neverland is one of those worlds that appears in multiple games, with KH1 and Birth by Sleep both adapting different tiny bits and pieces from Peter Pan in what I'm ultimately going to call a pair of original stories. Between the two games, Peter himself appears alongside Tinkerbell, Hook, Smee, Slightly, Cubby, Wendy, and the Crocodile. John and Michael never make an appearance, unfortunately, nor do the other 2/3 of the Lost Boys, nor the mermaids, nor the rest of Hook's crew, nor any of the Indians, even though their camp is a location in Birth by Sleep. Seeing as we get Wendy successfully returned to London in KH1, I suppose it's also worth noting that there's no mention of her parents or Nana the dog. Bits of movie plot or general concept that make it into each game include Hook's ship trying to blast Peter with cannon fire in Birth by Sleep, Hook having kidnapped Wendy at some point, Hook being hounded by the crocodile, and Peter impersonating either Hook or Smee. Halloweentown is a really interesting world to talk about because it appears in 2 games, and it's in between these games that the events of the movie actually take place. What that ends up meaning is that almost none of the movie's plot gets directly adapted in either game. No scene where Lock, Shock, and Barrel no Jack trying to explain the nature of Christmas to his fellow citizens, or usurping the holiday altogether for kicks. Jack expresses the very vague implication that he's a bit dissatisfied with how Halloweentown's turning out across KH1 and 2, but his total existential need to distance himself from the holiday doesn't translate from the movie. The most we get is broad plot beats like Oogie Boogie tormenting Santa with some contraptions, Sally distracting him with her disembodied leg, which I guess works twice because he's got amnesia, and Jack stopping him. For the most part, Halloweentown's adaptation thrives in characters, locations, and iconography. For instance, we do get the imagery of Jack in his own Santa outfit, plus the sleigh pulled by skeletal reindeer. Between the games, I don't think there's any major characters who don't get due screen time from the movie. Altogether, that's Jack, Sally, Oogie Boogie, Professor Finkelstein, the Mayor, Lock, Shock, Barrel, Zero, Santa, and Santa's elves. Literally any other characters in the movie who didn't make it in had maybe 2 lines of dialogue apiece. This is a dumb nitpick as far as adapting the dialogue goes, but to me, one of the most iconic bits of dialogue from the film comes near the end when Santa wishes everyone a happy Halloween and Jack replies with Merry Christmas. In KH2, we get the first half of that exchange, but Jack never responds in kind, and I always found that kinda weird. Speaking of KH2, a lot of those worlds are going to be at least a tier above this one, and it was surprisingly late into the writing of this script that I realized that wasn't going to be true of Beast's Castle. We've talked sequels and prequels, but this world might be the one and only midquel, as in a story that takes place within the timeline of the film's events, but isn't really interested in adapting the movie at all. It's kinda the opposite of Halloweentown in that sense. Another world where the events of the film totally happen off-screen, only instead of happening in between Sora's arrival, the film takes place before and after. We've got the characters, Beast, Belle, Lumiere, Cogsworth, Mrs. Potts, Chip, and even the big drawer lady are all here, living together in what's ostensibly the status quo of the movie's second act, and naturally Beast's curse and the backstory behind it are laid out accurately. But there's no mention of Gaston, LeFou, Belle's dad, or the exact circumstances of Belle having come to live here in the first place. Fitting the name of the world, the story never leaves Beast's Castle, and there's locations in that castle like the library which we just never see. I don't know, maybe Beast was too embarrassed at the prospect of Donald Duck realizing he's illiterate. Belle and Beast's personal conflict is only broadly similar to what it is in the film. In both, Beast is kind of a stubborn jerk who won't communicate, and in both he insists that Belle leave the castle for her own good, though for wildly different circumstances. This is because the game has it so it's explicitly a Kingdom Hearts original character that's stuck in Beast's craw, which unmistakably shifts the whole dynamic. Shifts it quite a lot, actually. I said that the events of the movie are presumably wrapped around Sora's visits, but the way the game story plays out, this isn't a version of Belle who I could picture voluntarily leaving the castle to discover Gaston and his mob, so who knows if we're meant to think that that even happens in this universe. We do get iconography like the ballroom dance, complete with a change in outfit, both with Beast and his human form shown in the game's credit sequence. Wonderland is bottom tier for the simple reason that, much like Deep Space, it only even attempts to adapt one extended sequence from the movie, and limply at that. Here it's Alice's trial, and let's just say that Wonderland is by far more concerned with being an exploration of game mechanics than it is with being a loyal adaptation. I say this world is attempting to adapt a scene, but really it's just adapting a broad plot point. Alice is indeed on trial by the Queen of Hearts, the card soldiers are present, as is the White Rabbit, and the Cheshire Cat intervenes in the proceedings in a roundabout way. Beyond those similarities, though, there's really nothing tying together the 2 versions. Alice is on trial for completely different crimes in both, none of the gags or dialogue carry over, none of the other characters appear anywhere in the world, save the Mad Hatter and March Hare appearing in a photo or painting or whatever this is. And that's a big deal because the trial in the movie eventually ends up involving almost every character in the film. Alice never gets big, the list goes on. This is definitely tied with Deep Space for how many liberties were taken when translating just a few minutes worth of film material into game form. If there's a third place entry in that arena, it's Monstro from KH1. This world quote-unquote adapts a section from the movie that's once again only a few minutes long, with Pinocchio and Geppetto escaping from the whale's gullet. All of Pinocchio's stuff is pretty small potatoes though, as the game opts to just have Pinocchio get led around the whale by Riku. There's no Pinocchio and Geppetto starting a fire to make Monstro sneeze, Pinocchio isn't half transformed into a jackass, heck, between this and Pinocchio's other appearance in these games, we don't even get to hear the word jackass, which is a real shame. We never actually see Pinocchio and Geppetto escape on screen, and also Figaro's Pinocchio's not here. The other appearance of material from Pinocchio in these games occurs with Prankster's Paradise and Dream Drop Distance. Dream Drop does something unique in the series by introducing the concept of mementos, which are scenes often involving the Disney characters that take place prior to Sora or Riku's arrival in that world. They're almost always direct translations of scenes from the movies, and they're all entirely optional. Know that mementos will generally always be counted when assessing how well a world adapts its movie, but for the sake of the exercise, I'll also note which scenes are covered in mementos rather than mandatory parts of the story. This world's mementos include Pinocchio's conversation with Jiminy where his nose grows, which is a visual so iconic that I wonder how many people realize that in the original film it only ever happens in the one scene. This scene gains points not just for the visual, but for being the only appearance of the Blue Fairy, though unfortunately for the game's sense of accuracy, that scene in the movie doesn't take place in Prankster's Paradise like is portrayed in the game. The other memento is a much better bit of accuracy as it adapts Pinocchio and Jiminy's conversation before jumping off a cliff basically word for word, with the only detail missing being that Pinocchio doesn't tie his donkey tail to a rock. Though, speaking of the donkeys, I wonder whether or not I should dock points from this world for not featuring Lampwick or the Coachman. You could argue that Sora arrives in Prankster's Paradise just after all the other boys have become donkeys, Lampwick included, so it makes sense for Pinocchio and Jiminy to be the only real characters here, but I don't know, it's an edge case. We do get the visual of Pinocchio swimming away from Monstro, and on that note, it's cool to have the bottom of the ocean as one of the world's locations in the first place. Pinocchio strapping a rock to himself and walking along the ocean floor to find Geppetto is a decently lengthy scene in the movie, and it's cool that it made it into the game when they'd be forgiven for not covering it. Altogether, Pinocchio is a bit of an odd case, since it adapts such a comparatively small chunk of movie, meaning that what it chooses to include stands out, but so does everything it chooses to leave out. Honestly, if you put this film's rep in either of the tiers above this one, I wouldn't blame you. I'm gonna say that the Borderline world, the one which transitioned us most cleanly from the bottom to tier 2, is 100 Acre Wood. The wood has pretty much an original story with each appearance, but those stories, especially in KH1, ultimately serve to house a pretty straightforward, if truncated, translation of moments and imagery from the film. In KH1, we get Pooh stuck in Rabbit's front door after eating all his honey, though unlike in the film, he's only stuck for a few minutes and not several days. We get Pooh using a balloon to steal honey from bees, but none of his pretending to be a rain cloud shenanigans. KH2 gives us the imagery of Pooh floating out of his own body for a dream sequence, as well as Piglet being bandied about by the four winds. Naturally, the games keep the film's use of a storybook as a framing device. We've got Pooh's stoutness exercises, and the interior of Pooh and Rabbit's houses are translated note perfect, including Pooh's Pooh-Coo clock and the fact that he lives under the name of Sanders. Most obvious, singular, and important cut from the film's cast is Christopher Robin, whose role as token human and fixer of everybody's problems is wholesale replaced by Sora. Pooh, Piglet, Tigger, Rabbit, Owl, Eeyore, Kangaroo, and Gopher all make it in, though certain character traits get lost with all the truncating, specifically the more silly and excitable sides of Rabbit and Gopher. We also end up losing the plot point from the movie that is Pooh and Tigger actually meeting each other for the very first time. None of the games give us any equivalent to the Heffalumps and Woozles song sequence, or for the 100 Acre Wood getting very floody and the ensuing hero parade during which Piglet gets forcibly evicted from his house. We also don't get the gang being lost in the misty woods or any of the snowy hijinks with Tigger caught in a tree. I'm wondering if I should dock points from KH3's appearance, which brings in the character of Lumpy the Heffalump, but otherwise doesn't attempt to adapt or translate anything from that character's debut movie. I assume. Sorry guys, I gotta draw the line somewhere. Not even I can hyperfixate so hard that I watch Pooh's Heffalump movie exclusively for this video. Next to last tier is what I'll call the close but not quite tier, and this section is for worlds which have the straightforward plot skeleton of the movie intact and feature the occasional bit of iconography or dialogue, but which omit too many characters or plot points or memorable moments for the similarities to be more than surface. For instance, we've got one of those different movies adapted by different games examples in the form of Agrabah. KH1 Agrabah very loosely adapts the first Aladdin, while KH2 adapts the direct-to-DVD sequel Return of Jafar. Aladdin, Jasmine, Genie, Jafar, Abu, the Magic Carpet, and Iago are all present in both, but the Sultan is entirely missing. KH1 Agrabah features the giant tiger head entrance to the Cave of Wonders being alive and semi-sentient, and both games feature the giant treasure room, so that's points for recognizable imagery. Where both these games let their movies down is in actually translating plot points. KH1 Agrabah adapts the idea of Aladdin having found the genie, Jafar stealing the lamp for himself, Aladdin facing off against Jafar and saving Jasmine, using the magic carpet to escape the Cave of Wonders, Jafar wishing to be first a sorcerer then a genie himself, and that's about it. Though he floats the idea, Aladdin never actually wishes to be Prince Ali, meaning his entire character arc from the film is cut, as is imagery like the parade, the Prince Ali outfit, and Abu as an elephant. All of Jafar and Iago's scheming as it exists in the film is cut, Aladdin and Jasmine's actual romance is cut, Aladdin never has his conflicts with either Jasmine or Genie, never has his lie revealed by Jafar, we never get giant snake Jafar, the list goes on. In KH2, we adapt the basic story of Iago's conflicting loyalties, saving the protagonist's life and then asking for them to put in a good word with Jasmine, only to get strong-armed back into villainy by Jafar and then being put in the doghouse until he risks his own life to save Aladdin. We've also got the general idea of Genie coming back after a long vacation around the world, and of course the actual return of Jafar. We don't get plot points like Aladdin and Jasmine briefly hitting the rocks when Jasmine discovers Iago, leaving the parrot to play love doctor for their relationship, nor do we get Jafar and Genie coming to blows over which of the two of them is more powerful. Yet, Return of Jafar is not actually a movie with a lot of plot, so KH2 surprisingly earns more in that arena than KH1 does, but it's still such a broad adaptation that it averages out between the two games into this tier, especially since by not ever getting to enter the Royal Palace or its grounds, there's a big chunk of both movies that never get their location properly portrayed. We also never get Abis Mal. I'm surprised that no one in any of the cutscenes ever says you'd be surprised what you can live through, which is a line of dialogue that pops up in Return of Jafar like 3 or 4 times. Carrying on from there, I want to move on with Port Royale. Pirates of the Caribbean is the other franchise besides Aladdin to get 2 movies explicitly adapted in 2 games. And in the broadest strokes, Visit 1 to Port Royale is a pretty straightforward adaptation of Acts 2 and 3 of Curse of the Black Pearl. We have the town under siege from Barbossa's crew, Will and Jack setting off to rescue a kidnapped Elizabeth. We're told but not shown that Will busted Jack out of prison. We see a very watered down version of the iconic
"You best start believing in ghost stories, Miss Turner."
We get Will threatening to off himself in order to rescue his companions, and the climactic fight between Jack and Barbossa plays basically the same as the movie. The concept of a parlay also appears in both game and film, albeit in wildly different circumstances. What's missing here, besides what I guess you'd call Act 4 of the movie, where Will and Elizabeth rescue Jack from being hanged, is a lot of major characters and the plot points associated with them. I get cutting Pintel and Rigetti, since they're just comic relief, and Mr. Gibbs provides a lot of exposition that the game decides to just give to Will. Jack's ragtag crew would have little to offer the story that's not already accomplished by Sora, Donald, and Goofy, so I get cutting them too. More substantially, the star-crossed nature of Elizabeth and Will's romance doesn't translate at all in game form, since we cut Elizabeth's dad, and much more importantly, we cut Norrington. Norrington is an extremely vital character in the film, being one part of a love triangle with Will and Elizabeth, and one part of a sort of moral triad with Will and Jack. This world honestly could have probably made it to the top tier if only they'd found a way to include his character. Sticking with pirates, the Caribbean in KH3 skips the second movie and instead adapts Acts 2 and 3 of World's End. This world is one of a couple which we'll talk about in this section, where plot points are adapted pretty faithfully, but Sora, Donald, and Goofy aren't there to experience most of them. The game is nice enough to give us some scenes lifted straight from the film which don't feature our main trio, like Jack making a deal with Cutler Beckett, and the two of them plus Davy Jones, Will, Elizabeth, and Barbossa making a follow-up agreement sometime later. Our main trio actually does get to be present for the crew and Jack reuniting in Davy Jones' locker, as well as a straightforward adaptation of Jones' own role in the climax, and the Green Flash, which signifies a return from the locker to the land of the living. We don't actually get to see the crew flip the boat upside down in the game, which is a shame, but it's nothing compared to the sheer degree of things and people who have been cut. As far as what our main trio is actually there to witness, we get zero indication of Jack hallucinating multiple versions of himself like in the film, but that's just the tip of the iceberg. Once again, there's no Norrington here, no crew members barring Mr. Gibbs, and no Elizabeth's dad, meaning we don't adapt his arrival in the locker, but there's also no Bill Turner and none of the other 9 pirate lords. Which makes sense, they're not really characters with much screen time minus Sao Fang, who even then doesn't affect the plot too much, but a lot of the plot of At World's End is built around Shipwreck Cove and the people in there. And Will's dad is half his entire story in that film, so it's a big omission here. We don't get to see Elizabeth become king of the pirates, we don't get to see her and Will get married, we do get to see Jack pull his tossing someone overboard with the power of stank breath trick, though it's with Luxord instead of Will, and we do get to see Will resurrected as the new captain of the Flying Dutchman, as well as Beckett's death scene. In a rarity for the series, we have a character, if you can call it a character, who's not really in the movie but was added for the game, that being the Kraken. In At World's End, we learn that the Kraken was killed off screen between movies, but in the game it's a massive part of the climax. In yet another rep for a direct-to-video film, this tier is also the best place for the Country of the Musketeers. You know, prior to working on this video, I'd only seen Mickey, Donald, and Goofy, the Three Musketeers, one time as a kid, and being much more familiar with Dream Drop Distance left me unprepared for how little of the movie actually got adapted. Not to mention how many bits I assumed had to be part of the movie but were actually original to the game. That includes the memento of Pete officially promoting Mickey, Donald, and Goofy to Musketeers, which is obviously a plot point in the film, but it plays out completely differently with entirely different dialogue. I also figured the way that Pete's boss fight ends had to be original to the film, but no. The movie resolves with Pete merely being punched in the face multiple times rather than being blown into oblivion by a stage cannon. Other small things I assumed had to be from the film which weren't were Pete giving Minnie an evil monologue about his plans for her, and the visual of his castle bathed in purple lightning. As far as the cast goes, we've got Mickey, Goofy, Donald, Pete, Minnie, and the Beagle Boys present from the film, which leaves Clarabelle Cow, Daisy Duck, and Troubadour the Turtle absent. And most surprisingly for me, Pluto is once again not here. What basically ends up happening in this world is that any scene which doesn't directly feature Mickey is completely cut. Combine this with how it's another in a sizable line of KH worlds where the romantic plotline from the movie is completely nixed, and that means basically everything is gone except for the broadest possible cliff notes of the story. Actually, this movie has 3 romantic plotlines cut. Gosh, if I didn't know any better, I'd say the reason Kyrie's got the shaft all these years is that Nomura just hates PDA. We get some things that are broadly adapted, like both the major fights with the Beagle Boys in the tower and on stage, as well as Minnie's carriage being assaulted mid-ride, only in the game we have the Beagle Boys being repped in that scene by a giant dinosaur. We get Mickey almost drowning, and the boss fight against Pete features Pete swinging around on stage props like in the movie. The locations all manage to make it in with quite a bit of visual accuracy, though I wonder if I should dock points from the Beagle Boys tower for not being at least 87 floors high. Thanks to the reality shift of this world, basically quick little micro games you can do in the middle of combat, we have some representation for the movie using a comic book as its framing device. The bit with Goofy launching away the Beagle Boys with that tree stunt is a memorable piece of slapstick from the movie, which gets a close enough translation, though the scene which initially sets up that gag is gone. What's missing from the characterization is a more broad portrayal of Goofy's intelligence and Mickey's small stature as genuine character conflicts. Much like Hercules, The Three Musketeers is a very, very wacky, gag-driven movie which doesn't really suit Kingdom Hearts without alteration, so about 90% of the humor is totally absent. Finally though, the dialogue to Donald abandoning Mickey as well as Mickey's confrontation with Pete directly afterwards is pretty film accurate. Okay, I said there was going to be a lot of KH2 rep here, so let's hop back there for a bit, starting with Land of Dragons, which adapts Mulan barely but recognizably. This movie tells an abridged version of the movie's events, starting with just after Mulan has met Mushu and ending with Mulan being honored after the defeat of Shan Yu. Given that framework, the game cuts a lot of plot and a total of 3 noteworthy characters, that being Crookie, Shang's father the general, and Chi-Fu the Emperor's console. We don't get the scene of Mushu faking the orders to get Mulan's platoon onto the front lines. Understandably, we don't have Sora, Donald, and Goofy skinny dipping with the other soldiers. There's no talking about the kind of girls we like, musically or otherwise. Mulan never gets the chance to display her cleverness or growth as a soldier until after her disguise is gone, barring the trick she pulls with launching a cannon into a mountain to start an avalanche with Mushu on board, which is kept from the film. Speaking of Mushu, he's the reason that she gets found out in this game rather than having been injured. The game gets an equivalent scene to the fight that breaks out when Mulan first arrives at camp, but this time Yao and Ling's aggression is directed at Sora, Donald, and Goofy. Our trio of heroes actually end up taking Yao, Ling, and Shanpo's place in the scene where Mulan climbs up the column to the Emperor's palace, which is the only aspect of the movie's climax that's remotely intact. There's no trick with the fan and the sword, and no death by fireworks. We're also missing Shang's character arc and paralleling journey to Mulan as someone who also wants to prove himself. Like Land of Dragons, Pride Lands is recognizably the movie's story, but its actual contents are totally gutted. Characters kept here are Mufasa, Simba, Timon, Pumbaa, Nala, Scar, Shenzi, Banzai, and Ed, with Sarabi, Zazu, and the other hyenas all being axed. Understandably, Sora, Donald, and Goofy enter the story at almost exactly the halfway point of the movie's runtime, just after the film has time-skipped to Simba as an adult. I suppose that means it gets plus points for translating the wildebeest stampede and Mufasa's death, as well as Mufasa telling young Simba about the stars, since by the standards of this video they'd be exempt from adapting any part of the film's opening half. Though it's in a completely different context, KH2 keeps the In the Heat of the Night reference from the movie, which, weird to think that there's 6 degrees of separation from Sora, Donald and Goofy, and Sidney Poitier. We sort of keep the hyenas laughing up a storm at the name of a Lion King, only now it's Simba instead of Mufasa. We keep Timon and Pumbaa ramming into the hyenas along with their weird little battle hop afterwards. We get the scene of Rafiki realizing Simba is alive, only without him saying that out loud, so it looks more like he just had a nervous break. It's actually Rafiki who alerts Nala to Simba being alive, so there's not really a surprise there like there was in the film. But we do at least get Simba and Nala reuniting in the process of rescuing Timon and Pumbaa from her. At that point though, the game heavily truncates about 15 minutes of movie into about 3 minutes of cutscene. Simba and Nala's post-reunion argument over him returning home is shaved down into like 3 lines. Simba's discussion with Cloud Mufasa is also extremely cut down, and Rafiki is removed from the scene entirely. Simba's iconic slow-motion run back to Pride Rock, gone. Timon and Pumbaa lamenting the romance between Nala and Simba, gone. Simba and Scar's confrontation once he does return plays out mostly the same dialogue-wise, definitely the single most faithful scene in the world in that department. Good thing too, because it's the only scene in the game where Scar's personality is remotely intact. We cut Scar begging for his life and being spared after Simba beats him the first time, and there's no implication whatsoever of him being immolated and or eaten alive by the hyenas. It's assumed that he just kind of dies from falling off Pride Rock. Beyond that, the most we get are some sparse lines of dialogue from the movie, and the game's credits giving us the birth of Kiara that happened at the end of the movie.
Atlantica is a really funny edge case because so much of the movie's events are stuff that our main trio just isn't present for, but the stuff they are present for covers the film material just thoroughly enough for this one to squeak in. It's another world that appears across multiple games, and it's the only movie besides Pinocchio that's overtly got material from one movie across 2 games. It also gets points for being one of only 2 movies on this entire list to translate the musical numbers, even if it is just under the sea and part of your world. And you know what? Kudos to KH Atlantica for being basically the only one of these to fully, explicitly center the romance as the central stake of the plot to the same degree that it is in the film. Even when the romantic nature of a pairing isn't being downplayed in these games, it's amazing how rare it is for the romantic arc to be as important to the game story as it is to the movie. Both KH1 and KH2 feature Ariel, Triton, Ursula, Sebastian, Flotsam, Jetsam, and Flounder, and KH2 brings in Prince Eric, as well as a couple of Ariel's sisters. Scuttle, Grimsby, and Max don't make it in since we don't really adapt any of Ariel's time with Eric between getting legs and losing them. Between the 2 games, we get a bunch of locations like Ariel's Grotto, complete with Jack in the Box, Triton's Throne Room, the shore, the musical theater, and obviously KH1 adapts the sunken ship and the appearance of Glut the Shark. KH1 also gives us Triton being a horribly abusive parent by physically destroying his daughter's property. KH2's Atlantica is the more straightforward adaptation of the film's plot, but again we're locked into Sora's POV for so much of it that we don't get to see most of it play out. In the world's cold open, we get to see Ariel rescue Eric, and Eric waking up to see her for the first time. We get the confrontation between Ursula and Triton, complete with the visual of Ursula being pancaked against the wall, and Ursula bargaining for Triton to take Ariel's place in the contract. We get Eric swimming down to distract her, Ursula turning giant and ultimately being impaled, though it's by trident rather than by boat in the game, and Flotsam and Jetsam murder duties are given to Sora, Donald, and Goofy. We get to see Ursula's control over Eric get broken in the game, but it's on the beach instead of during a wedding on a boat. The game gives us different dialogue when Eric and Ariel finally meet properly on the beach, and it also invents this whole thing with Ariel recovering Eric's pendant from whole cloth for reasons I can't really fathom. Finally, in KH2's credit sequence, we get to see Ariel and Eric's wedding adapted briefly. Something else that's kept across both games is Ursula's ability to see through Flotsam and Jetsam's eyes on her crystal ball thing. We keep Sebastian being the one who reveals Ariel's infatuation with Eric to her father via slip of the tongue, though in different circumstances between mediums. Funny little note about KH2 Atlantica is that having not seen The Little Mermaid in years prior to playing the game for the first time, I always forgot that the scene of Ariel revealing her true form to Eric by leaping out of the ocean and him following in after her is a scene completely original to the game and not cribbed at all from the movie. It's one of those very rare moments where Kingdom Hearts creates a scene with Disney characters out of whole cloth that's as iconic and charged with character and romance as a classic Disney movie. Let's move on with Enchanted Dominion and Birth by Sleep, which basically only adapts Sleeping Beauty's third act on account of the characters all entering the story so late. Though in saying that, it adapts its locations really well. You know, they didn't have to adapt the plot point of the entire kingdom being put to sleep alongside Aurora, since we never visit that locale, but it's cool that they did. On top of that, Maleficent having kidnapped Philip is taken straight from the movie. Anything to do with Maleficent in this world, especially in Aqua's story, is pulled from the film, including the specific visual effect of her teleporting around, which is a very cool grab. Something that's definitely missing is the super proactive role that the three fairies play in resolving the conflict. I feel like not a lot of people know this, but the fairies are pretty much the real protagonists of Sleeping Beauty, and here their role is pretty much usurped entirely by Aqua. Seeing as we never visit the kingdom, that also means we never get to see either of the kings, who are pretty massive characters. Accepting that Terra is a stand-in for the huntsman in this world, Dwarf Woodlands is probably the earliest that any KH character enters a Disney story, with the Queen assigning him to Snow White's murder in literally the film's third scene. We sorta kinda adapt the iconic scene of Snow running scared through the woods as a gameplay sequence, specifically an escort mission where the trees really are out to get her, rather than being optical illusions. We get the scene of the Queen disguised as an old hag successfully poisoning Snow, but we don't get to see the Queen make the transformation. Beyond that though, if a scene takes place inside the dwarf cabin, you can bet that there's no equivalent for it in the game. And that's a lot of scenes, like most of the movie. Though I guess it's to be expected when so many of the scenes in question are just long sequences of the animators having fun and not advancing plot at all. Still, that means no seeing Snow meet the dwarves for the first time or any of their shenanigans. We do get to see the dwarves hold a funeral for her, we see the prince wake her up, and we see the dwarves get their forehead kisses. Awkwardly, we don't get to see the queen's death or her implicitly being eaten by vultures. We don't even get to see her defeated or receive any comeuppance on screen. She just kinda disappears from the narrative in a puff of smoke. We keep the basic idea of the dwarves working in the mines and the visual of them marching in single file. The only real moments of super faithful adaptation outside of the funeral and reawakening is the Queen's opening conversation with the mirror, which is word for word right out of the movie's opening scene until Terra makes his appearance. It's only even a throwaway line in the film, but we also leave the world without the confirmation that the Queen is indeed Snow White's stepmother. Moving away from Birth by Sleep, Arendelle probably goes here too, why not? It's honestly a little bit of a shock. Starting this list, I figured I'd end up putting it in bottom tier because Sora, Donald, and Goofy spend so much time away from the main cast that it's basically an original side story, but then I asked myself, what really happens in that side story that's not just reacting directly to the plot of the film? Honestly, it's less of a side story and more like the trio serving as the film's liner notes. As far as the stretch of the plot which the game covers, there is a lot that's cut. Hans is physically present but has no dialogue. We barely get a good look at his face, so I'm gonna count him as among the cut characters. By extension, any plot points that Hans is at the center of are cut. Duke of Weaseltown is cut, the trolls are cut, Olaf's here but his interest in experiencing summer is all gone. Honestly, it's a lot gone from the film, but it stays in this tier because what did make it in was translated extremely faithfully. Imagery like Elsa running on the frozen lake and Anna saving Elsa from Hans might as well be ported straight from the movie. And the same is true for entire scenes like Elsa and Anna talking in the Ice Palace, the initial confrontation with Marshmallow, Elsa and Anna as kids, though the game presents that as a flashback, Kristoff's habit of talking to himself through the proxy of Sven, and most notoriously, Let It Go plays out in its entirety. If anything, you can tell that the slavish adherence to the film in places is precisely why the main trio isn't present for more of it. Frozen is, maybe predictably, a sticky wicket by the standards I've set for myself. We'll encounter worlds in the next tier that take Arendelle's same basic approach of adapting the movie sparsely but faithfully, and while Frozen's adaptation is debatably much more faithful, it's also just sparse enough to tip over into a weaker translation. Top tier is where we hit worlds where by the end I feel like I've effectively experienced the broad arc of the film, and Arendelle just cuts too many emotionally and narratively pivotal beats to convey that feeling. The top tier is pretty much just the movie tier. This is the tier where multiple large plot points and or chunks of dialogue make it through almost entirely unscathed. If there's any plot points or characters cut from the movie in this tier, then they're all cuts that largely don't hurt the story, to the point that I myself likely would have taken them out if asked to translate those movies to Kingdom Hearts. A perfect example of exactly that description, maybe the premier example, Corona/Tangled. I initially fought with myself a lot on which tier to put this one in, actually, but even though Corona made a lot of cuts in the transition to KH3, so few of those cuts, if any, actually hurt the narrative, or undermine the feeling that we're playing through the film's story. Tons of scenes make it in with dialogue and staging 95% intact, but I suppose it's good to start with what was cut. For characters, we lose all of the friendly ruffians, all the Royal Guard members, sans Max, the Stabbington brothers, and Rapunzel's parents. Of that whole group, the latter two are the only ones whose absence is meaningfully felt, as everyone else has their story function covered by our Kingdom Hearts heroes and bad guys. Sora, Donald, and Goofy enter the story just after Flynn/Eugene's first encounter with Maximus, so we never see that chase and instead open with Flynn being chased by Heartless. This ends up reflective of the whole world, in which Heartless and Nobodies are functionally the replacement for the Royal Guard and the Stabbington brothers as the figures hunting down our leads. The game cuts quite a tremendous chunk of Act 2, namely everything from the detour to the Snuggly Duckling to the arrival at the Kingdom Square. This means we don't get Sword Meme, we don't get the action scene at the dam, or the campfire scene which occurs afterward. We lose the Rapunzel Knows Best confrontation, which I mainly note as a meaningful cut because that argument is a small but impactful show of character growth, which Rapunzel doesn't get otherwise, and it means her choosing to go against Gothel by the end holds just that bit less oomph. We cut Flynn getting sent to prison and broken out, which is a shame because I think there's a very easy way to keep that little bit of the story, and have Sora, Donald, and Goofy be the ones who break him out in place of the Duckling Gang. Looking at all those cuts laid out like that, you can see why I doubted its top tier placement, but it's worth noting how even with this broad strokes translation, KH3 captures the vibe of Tangled so much better than it does Frozen. I think a lot of that has to do with how, despite how much of it was cut, it's translated to game form just well enough that the intended arcs of the story come through emotionally. Like, we may lose Flynn getting saved from the noose by the ruffians, but the broad intent of the plot point comes through because Flynn is still left for dead by Mother Gothel, and ultimately saved by Max. We don't get the Snuggly Duckling, but we do get Flynn using scary ruffians, the Heartless in this case, as a way to try and convince Rapunzel to go back home and drop their arrangement. The Stabbington brothers are such thin characters that letting their plot function be served by the game's enemies totally works without hampering the story, even if it means the otherwise completely movie-accurate scene of Gothel reuniting with Rapunzel is a bit awkward because she's still talking like she just knocked out some goons instead of having eviscerated literal monsters. Of course, we adapt the iconic I See the Light sequence with Rapunzel and Eugene, minus the singing, but with otherwise accurate dialogue and visuals. We adapt Rapunzel seeing the mural of herself and her parents in the Kingdom Square, realizing her true identity back in the tower, and her following confrontation with Gothel. We adapt Flynn getting stabbed, cutting Rapunzel's hair, Gothel aging and falling out of the tower, Rapunzel healing Flynn, pretty much note-perfect, nearly shot-for-shot translation on each of those beats, as well as Rapunzel's manic-depressive freak-out upon leaving the tower at the start. Rapunzel and Flynn's first meeting is slightly abridged and adds the wrinkle of Flynn's internal monologue which wasn't in the movie, but otherwise is a perfect translation from film to game, down to Pascal threatening Flynn with bodily harm. We do cut out the smolder though, big loss that. More seriously, I was kinda surprised to remember that we cut the satchel with the crown in it out of the pair's negotiations. The crown still plays a part in the story here, so it's kinda awkward that it's not established as Eugene's stake in the adventure when he meets Rapunzel. I suppose it works out for Flynn though, cause that cut also means that he doesn't have to suffer 2 concussions in the space of 10 minutes. All around, the inclusion of the crown as a plot device within the game is super awkward. We keep Gothel's panicked search for Rapunzel when she initially realizes she's not in the tower, and her discovering the crown underneath the stairs, but we never see Gothel hand set a crown over to Rapunzel, so she just magically has it on her all of a sudden between scenes. No Stabbington brothers means there's no real explanation for what Flynn's doing in this scene before he's intercepted by Gothel. We get the image of Rapunzel having tried the crown on, but only in flashback form. We don't get to see Rapunzel trying to convince Gothel to let her see the lantern since that happens before Sora enters the story, but that dialogue is actually taken and turned into narration for the world's cold open. Neat touch. The Kingdom Dance sequence makes it in from the movie, and by the way, bonus points because I really appreciate it when KH opts to adapt scenes which aren't action beats, or even strictly plot relevant as gameplay rather than pure cutscene. In a way more obvious here than in any of the other KH3 worlds barring maybe Monstropolis, Corona gets credit for some note-perfect translations of setting and location. The kingdom, the tower enclave, and the immediately surrounding forest are all practically identical from film to game. Although both the Snuggly Duckling and the dam are cut from the game, the underground cavern that connects them both makes it in as its own location that's recognizably pulled from the movie. Rapunzel's team-up traversal move where she swings across a chasm with her hair is lifted straight from the film as well. The imagery of Rapunzel leaving the tower for the first time is also a very memorable one I'm glad made it in. Like Corona, I also really struggled with which tier to place City of Bells, before ultimately deciding it edged its way into top tier. I'm gonna be completely honest, part of that decision may have just been how absolutely anemic top tier was looking compared to the other two, but really it's shocking to me how many details from the movie made it into the game. Quasimodo, Frollo, Esmeralda, Phoebus, and the Gargoyles are all here, which just leaves Clopin and I guess also Jolly as the only major characters who didn't make the cut. The relationships between all these characters are carried over from the movie, with the massive, predictable caveat that any notion of romance is outright discarded until the very last second, where Esmeralda and Phoebus get together despite hardly interacting in the game. As a result, there's a lot of exchanges and inner turmoil on Quasi's part that don't quite make the cut. Frollo is still out to hunt Esmeralda's people, and specifically her, and we get Quasimodo helping her leave the cathedral the way he did in the film. We get the vague semblance of a translation of Quasimodo as the King of Fools, so again, we can't really do crowd, so the context is different. We get the detail that Phoebus was specifically called to the city from the wars, which is maybe the thing I was most surprised got included. We get Esmeralda's pendant being the map to the Court of Miracles, Phoebus defending the townspeople from Frollo and then being fired with extreme prejudice, Quasi and Phoebus attempt to warn Esmeralda, turning out to be a trap by Frollo, and Quasi saving Esmeralda from being burned at the stake. Most importantly, we get the iconic cry of Sanctuary from the top of the cathedral, though we don't get Quasimodo bound in chains, which he subsequently breaks in a feat of super strength. We've got some more memento scenes here, namely Frollo impressing upon Quasimodo how cruel the world is, and his conversation with Phoebus at the top of Notre Dame, both of which are translated basically line for line. Somewhat surprisingly to me, we get Frollo admitting to having killed Quasimodo's mother, then subsequently dying in the exact way that he did in the film, with the dialogue once again being basically verbatim. By that same token, we have Quasimodo almost dying but being saved by Phoebus the same way in both versions. Not everything that makes it in is necessarily translated directly, of course. Some of the dialogue exchanges that Quasi has with Esmeralda and the gargoyles are reworked to happen between him and Riku, for instance. And as far as locations go, environments are rendered pretty true to the movie, minus some pretty egregious liberties taken in expanding the Court of Miracles, and a lot of plot points get directly translated. Seeing as it mostly adapts the movies with the simplest scripts and the smallest casts, you'd think it would be a shoo-in for more Birth by Sleep worlds to make it past tier 2. But Castle of Dreams is the only one which just about scooches into top tier, if for no other reason than the sheer amount of dialogue it keeps. Included characters are Cinderella, Jack, the Prince, Tremaine, Anastasia, Drusilla, the Fairy Godmother, the Grand Duke, and Lucifer. The King is the big character who's completely missing. Frankly, it's really weird not to have him at the ball, when the whole thing was his idea in the film. Bruno the dog/footman is also missing, as is the horse. I don't know, does the horse have a name? I've got no clue. I'm iffy on if I should bother mentioning that all of the birds and the other mice Saint-Jacques don't show up in the game. There's just enough of them that I could see someone considering them a crowd who wouldn't be included in the game for hardware reasons, but I think they're so present throughout the parts of the story being played through that it'd be weird not to mention them. This is Another World, which plants a main character in the position of a character from the film. This time it's Ventus who takes up Gus's role as the quote-unquote mouse that Cinderella frees from the mousetrap, and who helped Jack in getting materials for the homemade ball gown while fending off that darn cat. Though the dialogue's altered, Jack alerting Cinderella to this presence and explaining the situation to this newcomer is recognizably from the film. Jack's description of Rusifi and his understanding that Tremaine will keep Cinderella too busy to finish her dress is the same as the film. Cinderella's lamenting about the ball when that does indeed happen is the same as the film, as is her dialogue when the dress is destroyed and when she meets the fairy godmother. Worth noting is that we don't get to see any of the godmother's magic feats in that last scene beyond making the coach and the dress. We keep the dialogue of Tremaine and the stepsisters not recognizing Cinderella as they watch her and the prince dance, and the dialogue as they attempt to fit the glass slipper. Naturally, it all ends off with the scene of the slipper finally fitting Cinderella as the film does. We also keep little things like the Grand Duke calling Cindy Mademoiselle and Senorita as he chases after her at midnight, but the chase doesn't continue on from there as it does in the film. A detail that I can understand cutting out of the game, but which I personally thought was important, is that Cinderella doesn't even realize it's the prince that she's dancing with in the film. Naturally, the major locations like the chateau, the castle, and the grounds are all true to the film. The innards of the house, which you explore through Esven and Aqua, are also all film accurate down to the cobwebs. Believe it or not, originally I was going to put the grid in mid-tier, but then I rewatched Tron Legacy for this video and realized that it was a serious candidate for the #1 spot. Frankly, it's fitting that this film would be in this tier, since Tron Legacy debatably only exists in the first place because of Kingdom Hearts and Tetsuya Nomura's extreme love of the first film. I gotta imagine the guy was just as taken with the sequel and eager to adapt it as loyally as possible. Honestly, I find it kind of funny because I adore both Tron Legacy as a movie and The Grid as a world in Dream Drop, and my affinity for those two things happened basically independent of each other. It's crazy just how much of the film's dialogue and even shot composition was ported directly into the game. It's a lot, to the point that if they really wanted to, they could just use the movie's audio in place of new voice acting for most of the scenes and call it a day, especially in Riku's story. Sam, Kevin, Cora, Clue, and Rinsler make it in from the film. Sadly, Michael Sheen and Daft Punk do not. The whole little plot cul-de-sac surrounding Michael Sheen's character Castor is cut as a result, meaning we also lose the character Jem. Also absent is Clue's right-hand program Jarvis. Those cuts were why I initially considered dropping the world down a tier, but I ultimately decided it was a comparatively small and inconsequential bit of plot to lose, all things considered. The main things the game loses for cutting it is that Kevin losing his disc and Cora being incapacitated now happen entirely off-screen, and I've got other worlds in this tier that have cut much more vital bits of plot. Pretty much every location in the film is either a perfect recreation of a locale in the movie or a recognizable approximation, only missing certain small things. Like how the Disc Wars arena where you fight Rinsler doesn't have any stairs, and the Light Cycle arena has no ramps or gaps or loops, or how all the skyscrapers no longer really feel like buildings you could conceivably enter and there's no Flynn's arcade building. Speaking of the Disc Wars arena, the Rinsler boss fight nicely translates the imagery of his and Sam's fight from the movie, including his signature move of dropping from the ceiling for massive damage. The visual of the slow-motion light cycle activation is brought over from the movie, except it's done with Riku instead of Sam. Mementos include Kevin and Sam discussing the portal and how they intend to go back home, as well as both of them making the plan to blitz the portal while Cora's unconscious. The former scene plays out exactly as it does in the movie, minus both Cora's presence and the detail that Clue tricked Sam into the grid as part of a trap. You want to know how accurate to the film the dialogue in this world is? It includes the War Games reference. Flynn's dialogue explaining what ISOs are and how Clue reacted to them is taken almost word for word from the film. Only instead of explaining it to Sam over dinner, he's explaining it to Sam and Riku on the Solar Sailor. We also get Kevin taking ownership of Clue's actions and lamenting his chase for perfection from that same scene. Cora allowing herself to be captured by Rinsler plays out the same as in the film, though the game also places some dialogue between Kevin and Sam from slightly later in the film into that scene, as well as the reveal that Rinsler himself is Tron. The dialogue is still note perfect to the movie, just shifted around slightly as the plot is truncated by cutting Clue's big villain speech. Though interestingly, that scene in the game is also home to another one of those lines I assumed must be from the film which isn't, namely when Kevin says if you chase two rabbits you won't catch either. We get an approximation of rescuing Cora on Clue's ship, now with added Riku handing Rinsler his lunch on a Keyblade platter. Of course, the thing that it would have been the biggest shame to lose is Clue kicking Kevin in the gut, then tossing Sam, then kicking Kevin in the face, so I'm glad that's here. The whole climax plays out just as the movies did. I will say, there's one major plot point that I'm earnestly sad didn't make it in the game, and that's the light jet chase just before the film's climax. Not only could that have been a really fun gameplay section, but it also means we get no closure on Rinsler rediscovering his purpose as Tron and redeeming himself. Whew, that was a lot. At the end of the day, if I must decide who's the singular best adaptation of a Disney World into Kingdom Hearts, twist my arm, I'm gonna have to go with Corona. The Grid is a close second. I truly was surprised just how much of the film made it into Dream Drop distance unchanged, but it misses out on a first place on account of Tangled having just as much translated from the film, on top of being the only Disney story in these games that manages to keep in anything from Act 1, outside of flashbacks or cold opens. I feel like we've ended on a bit of an anticlimax, but then for this type of video, I'm not really sure what a climax looks like. I just talked about 30 movies across 30 game worlds. Give me a break, okay? Like I said at the top of the video, I'd been working on this for months, and I knew a 2023 release wasn't realistic. Thank you so much for watching. This was a real endeavor. Probably the single toughest video that I've ever made, and I hope that you enjoyed it. Thank you once again to March Caprice for letting me participate. Enjoy the rest of the March.